Welcome back, everybody, to the Unity4J #ProtectJulian marathon all weekend long online vigil in support of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. My name is Suzie Dawson. I'm an activist, a journalist, and the president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. Welcome to day 3 of the stream. Next, I have with me Piers Robinson, who is a professor at the University of Sheffield. Piers, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Suzie.
Thank you so much for being here with me. I was hoping you could take a minute to just explain your field of expertise and how it relates to your interest in WikiLeaks and Julian Assange.
Well, I did a PhD looking at media and intervention in humanitarian crises, and that really led into an academic area of research concerning war, conflict, the role of the media, the mainstream media. And in the last 10 years, I've been very much focused on looking a bit beyond the media and looking at propaganda, the way in which powerful actors manipulate information and then manipulate that information to then go through the media to get to the population, etc. And that's pretty much been the core concern that I've had. So I've looked at things such as the Iraq War, looked at the intelligence running up to that. I look at Syria now quite closely. But generally very interested in geopolitics, conflict, and the manipulation now of information and propaganda. So really, I guess WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, I mean, this very much sat upon my area. I mean, I first became aware of them after, obviously, the Iraq War, and you had the initial sort of leaks of information coming out, and there's a video footage, I think, of the helicopter opening fire on a Reuters news team in Baghdad. Obviously was a real sort of key moment in terms of my awareness and many people's awareness of WikiLeaks. And obviously in terms of my research area and research interests, it raised this question. We're in this new media environment now where there's potentially a radical transparency of information, etc. And so I think for a lot of us, it was very exciting. It was, wow, this is something we can really start to get information out, can really challenge governments, can really help get the truth to the public and so on. I was always a bit skeptical of that to begin with, because I thought, well, okay, what's the reaction going to be? And of course, now, however many years on from those early days, we're in a very difficult situation now where obviously Julian Assange is essentially being put in an incredibly difficult position, is essentially being held against his will. So things haven't quite panned out the way we would have hoped them to in terms of radical transparency. But that's how it first came to my awareness. And obviously, in a sense, what he does and what WikiLeaks does sits really very much in my area of interest. And I suppose what's happening to him now and what we're having to do now fits in with sort of what I look at in terms of understanding propaganda, the way people are manipulated in democracies, and the way information is manipulated and controlled. So this is all, sometimes I'm not sure whether I'm involved or observing sort of interaction between the two with issues such as this.
So WikiLeaks has changed the game for your field of study. Would you say that?
It's changed the game in the sense that, I mean, along with the internet and along with alternative media, it's clearly changed the potential for alternative information for challenges to political power. But in some ways, I don't think it's changed a lot of the fundamentals. You know, we still live in a situation where governments have considerable power over us and over the information we get. I think that's been increasingly challenged in recent years, and so it has changed things. But we're actually in a continual struggle, really, I think, and I'm sure you'd agree that we had a degree of transparency for a while. There's now this tremendous pushback from governments and powerful actors through bots, artificial intelligence, etc., to try to control the information that's circulating, even through the independent and alternative media. And then, of course, there's these really sort of straightforward coercive attempts to control the information, and that's exactly what we see with Julian Assange at the moment. This is coercive action by state powers. So things have been changed, right? And there's potential, but there's definitely a tremendous pushing back from governments and economic actors, etc., to try to regain control. So it's a continual struggle. I'm not quite sure where we are at the moment in terms of that balance between the two. I think perhaps there's everything to play for. Governments might succeed in getting greater control over the information environment, or they might not, and we might start to see, as we see elsewhere, sort of more fundamental changes going on in Western societies in terms of politics, in terms of awakening as to, I guess, the imperial role of the West in the global politics. I think there's everything to play for at the moment, and it takes brave people such as Julian Assange to I think, lead the way in some sense, to really sort of help mobilize people. But it's, I try to not be pessimistic or be stupidly optimistic. Everything's to play for, but it is a time where people, I think, need to stand up and need to really push to defend Assange, and also to push for, better democratic debate, better control over our governments than we have had for quite some time.
I certainly know as an activist that the struggles that we fight are intergenerational, that there's this very long history that tracks back behind each of us. I remember as a new activist here going and seeing the movie about the 1999 Seattle World Trade protests and hearing them say, whose streets, our streets, and thinking to myself, how did they know our chants? Like, because here I am at 2011 as a new Occupy protester thinking we've thought these chants up, and having that defining moment where I realized, oh my God, this chant is older than me, older than my generation, goes back into history, and we're just carrying on the struggle. What can you tell me about the history of this dichotomy of the control structure that wants to control information and limit access to the public to that information, and the visionaries like Julian who come along and try and blow that wide open and give the people the information? Does this exist throughout history? How far back does it go?
Well, I think, you can go back a very long way in history and look at sort of battles over information and communication, etc. I think it's useful to delimit it in terms of looking at, we're primarily concerned about Western democracies, or we're concerned about the liberal democracies in Australia, etc., and we're concerned about the ways in which these democracies operate and have operated. Now, certainly through, if you look at the emergence of democracy in Western society, you do have this struggle for sort of pulling power and to actually sort of bring a proper not devolution, but a proper evolution of the situation, so that you actually have people have control over governments and so on. So you have the emergence of democracy, etc. But then, of course, you've always had this pushback against democracy, that too much democracy is a dangerous thing to powerful interests. And I think it's good to get into the 20th century and to think about it in terms of the emergence of mass media, mass communications, mass literacy. And then what I think you start to see is this really important role that propaganda starts to play in Western democracies. This idea that perceptions, opinions, and behavior has to be controlled in contemporary democracies. And that requires propaganda. It requires various forms of propaganda. And Eddie Bernays, the founding father of public relations, would talk about the importance of, I think, the intelligent manipulation of the mind. Early political theorists such as Lasswell talked about the need to control democracy. And I think really throughout the 20th century, you see a steady erosion of democracy throughout certainly American Britain and certainly many other democracies, where the sophistication of propaganda activities has gradually increased, so that really the degree of genuine consent and debate and open and free debate is getting less and less and less. There are these kind of key moments in the 20th century. The Black Civil Rights Movement, etc., is an important moment where you see this mobilization and change. You see the Vietnam War, of course, in terms of the anti-war movement, and in the 70s, the kind of challenge to power. And I think these were, in a sense, important points of progress. But I think it may be a case of one step forward and two steps back. I certainly think that when you get to the mid-20th century, 1960s, 70s onwards, you've seen a progressive concentration of power, across Western democracies, increasingly effective propaganda, to the point where you then get to 9/11, the war on terror, and where we are until today. I think we're in a really desperate times in terms of the state of our democratic institutions, the state of our mainstream media, that entity which is supposed to act as a check on government is in a dreadful state at this point in time in terms of not doing its job, etc. And so I think you've had this real, and of course WikiLeaks has been a lot of it's been about exposing corruption. Kind of the corruption that we have today in Western democracies is I think worse than any earlier point over the last 60, 70 years. And so I think these struggles have weakened. I think the power has become more concentrated. But the thing which is, as it were, given a hope pushed back has been to an extent the internet, and to an extent the alternative media, which that has facilitated. But that's always been a double-edged sword. And this is a really interesting little parallel. I'll finish in a second. But if you go back to the Vietnam War and you look at the mobilization of protests, that actually needed, to a large extent, mainstream media to actually start to, and with a few journalists, start to really recognize that there were problems going on with the war in Vietnam. And you saw an interplay between the anti-war movement and the mainstream media, etc., really helping to consolidate and to grow that movement. And I think that probably the same goes for things such as the civil rights movement. The problem we have at the moment is that whilst we have the alternative media, the independent media, there's a kind of fragmentation that goes with it. And to the extent that it hasn't been often not able to get the mainstream media because they've been corrupted more than ever before, it's real difficult to actually engage the mainstream media. We're stuck in a position where there's a lot of people trying to do things, trying to change things, but we have a difficulty to really consolidate and mobilize and affect change. And you see this clearly with the lack of the anti-war movement, of course, in relation to all of the conflicts that we've been seeing over the last 17 years, initiated or fueled by the West. So again, this raises this issue of it's a very mixed picture in terms of the balance of power and so on.
Absolutely. Well, Vietnam War is very relevant to the discussions we've been having. Todd Pierce said yesterday, who's a steering committee member for Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, he was saying that we needed WikiLeaks during the Vietnam War. And he was saying, if we had a WikiLeaks, if we had, Daniel Ellsberg and Pentagon Papers was fantastic, but it was late in the picture. He's saying if earlier than that point we had a WikiLeaks, that it could have changed everything, that it could have saved thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives. Daniel Ellsberg makes a really interesting point, which is that while he's largely credited with ending Vietnam War, he said there was actually a 4-year period of time between when he leaked the Pentagon Papers and when they were finally able to get rid of Nixon and bring an end to the war. And he said that what he learned from that is that powerful information can actually have quite a long gestation period or a saturation period to make it through to the public, and that active whistleblowing can plant a seed. I think we see a similar situation with Chelsea Manning. There are still to this day, other WikiLeaks releases. We had, I think a couple of months ago, New York Times had a big scoop about Saudi Arabia. And at the bottom of their article, it said this information was sourced from leaked Saudi government cables, but didn't mention that they were from WikiLeaks' release of the Saudi files some years ago. So information remains relevant true information remains relevant long after, when it's not just a guaranteed immediate impact, and its impact can be felt for years to come. And I think that it could be for generations to come in the case of WikiLeaks.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, from this academic point of view of trying to figure out sort of when you go back to Vietnam, I mean, there's quite a debate about how much the change was driven by the journalists and how much the debate was really changed by decisions made within the power centers and so on about the course of the war. And it's always very difficult to disentangle this analytically sometimes. But I think you're absolutely right that, these things can have, or they often have, a much longer term impact, or they come to fruition over a much longer period. And I think, you know, it's always very difficult for us when we're caught in the immediate stream of events to really figure out sort of, you know, what's really important. You know, has this particular movement or has this alternative media source been critical in changing the terms of the debate? It's really difficult to sort of see the wood for the trees when it's happening around you. But I think it certainly is the case that if we look at Western society at this point in time and we look at the slow accumulation of information, and I'm thinking primarily here in terms of the war on terror and the conflicts we've been involved in, this builds over time, and it increases, I think, ultimately the likelihood that you do have a real emergence of a consolidated political drive to end wars, for example, a really concerted drive to restore democracy, deal with economic problems, and so on.
So how heartening has it been for you seeing on the pushback, the public pushback to the persecution of Julian? Do you see that? I mean, you talked earlier about there's this struggle going on, and it does seem to me that the outcome of the struggle is going to be defining. It's going to be defining for the public and for the power centers. But we do see now, I mean, hashtag Protect Julian didn't exist at, for me, local 5 p.m. on Friday. 3 hours later, it was trending in Washington, D.C. and in the United States as a whole, in Sydney, Australia, and Australia as a whole, and then was #1 trending topic in Ecuador. This information, I feel like Julian has been silenced, but we collectively raising our voices can actually influence and change both his situation and ultimately our own.
I mean, sure, that is very heartening to hear what you've just described. I mean, I haven't been following closely sort of what's trending and what isn't, but of course it's always heartening when you have what appears to be, you know, even with the kind of levels of manipulation and censorship there appear to be going on social media, you can still succeed in being trending, etc., and drawing a very large audience, etc. And that is heartening, and I think it does indicate, you know, what you know, many of us who are activists or be involved in challenges to power always think that sort of there are people want to know, people want there to be justice, people want an end to war, etc., and they will engage. You know, people are not apathetic, and people are not simply disengaged, as we are sometimes told by some political scientists. People really want things to change and want to make a difference. And so, yeah, sure, it's always heartening when you see people getting on board, etc. I'd add to that, though, again, this importance of then carrying this on, how we build things from here is really, really important. Is that, I mean, certainly from an academic point of view, and looking across the period from the late 90s through the early 21st century, you have this you do have this rhetoric surrounding the internet and the empowering nature of it, and people seize upon particular sort of examples of mobilization, but often that doesn't follow through to a more sustained, as it were, grassroots mobilization. And so I think one of the challenges for us is to find or think through ways in which, you know, the kind of energy you can harness through the internet, etc., through these kind of events, how it can then be transformed into sustained, ultimately grassroots, also face-to-face movements, etc. And it's really important to keep that in mind. But for sure, that doesn't take away from that. You know, it's important that this is happening. I would say, and as I'm sure you'd agree, and many of the people listening would agree, is that, you know, we have a mainstream media at the moment which is failing time and time again in terms of bringing the truth to people. And really, it's, you know, I think we can spend a bit of our time sort of demanding that people in the mainstream media start to do their job. Stop, as you were talking about earlier, talking about smears, stop circulating the smears. We seem to live in a political culture now where most of the time we don't have rational debate. We have people being smeared, and Julian Assange being smeared, sexual allegations, etc., smeared as a Russian agent and so on. This is going on across the board, so certainly in the UK context at the moment. And the mainstream media, many in the mainstream media, are perpetuating it. They are the people responsible for, as it were, communicating these smears. And so I think, you know, we should all be sort of giving a hard time, in a sense, to the mainstream media, who I think to a very large extent have failed Julian Assange, have failed to support what he's doing, and have, in many circumstances, simply been conduits for the smears which have been levelled against him.
Absolutely. We were just discussing earlier, Lee Stranahan and I were discussing George Galloway's recent special on Julian Assange, where he actually, a TV special he did, and he actually went out on the streets of London and talked to the average Joe, what do you think about Julian? What do you think about WikiLeaks? And he found that they were almost uniformly supportive of Julian and WikiLeaks. And Lee and I were musing about, somehow, as journalists and academics, we are very conscious of the smears. We're very conscious of who's publishing what, when they're publishing it, what they're saying, what the narratives are, etc. But maybe we're not so conscious about the impact on the public, because it seems that the public may be a little bit more resilient to those smears. And maybe that's a modern day thing. Maybe that's a 2019, after the results of having been, particularly egregiously lied to in the last 20 years. On a routine basis by the mainstream media, but maybe the average Joe is a bit more resilient than we give them credit for to those smears. And that's not to say that the smears aren't heinous, and that, obviously they shouldn't exist. Obviously the mainstream media are deeply unethical and systemically corrupt. But we as people seem to be wisening up a bit. And I think that's that awakening that you're just talking about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that there is this sense in which, if we think about the broader context, of this loss of democracy, the wars that we have been involved in for so long now, that you do have, I think, amongst a lot of the population, as soon as you get away from the privileged establishment, which the mainstream media is a part of, people are beginning to wake up and realize what's going on. That's certainly the sense that I get. In the last couple of years, I've been involved in these events, Media on Trial in the UK. And we've always been surprised at the numbers of members of the public coming to the event, and really and really how aware and informed they were of the kind of degree to which manipulation and propaganda was circulating in Western democracies. And so I think people really have changed, and there is a growing awareness. And there is a point, this idea of the politics of smear. There was a book called The Smear, published a couple of years ago, which documents a lot of this. But the politics of smearing people, the politics of engaging in deception in war, which obviously WikiLeaks and Assange have been excellent at revealing, and so on. This only works for a certain period of time. At some point, people become aware of what's going on. And I think we're definitely at that point, and you can see this reflected across the political situations across many Western democracies, is that a lot of people in the population are aware of what's going on. They want change, they're trying to mobilize, and so on. And so, governments can't get away with it, powerful actors can't get away with it forever. And certainly with smear, after a while lose their currency. If you accuse everybody of being a Russian agent, then it loses its force, etc. And we're definitely at that point, I think. Definitely at that point.
Yeah, so the lies have an expiry date. One of my favorite people in the world is the anti-war activist David Swanson. And I have a couple of his books here, actually, but right behind me I have War is a Lie by David Swanson. And it's a remarkable book. It deconstructs all of the lies that are propagated, the propaganda that is forced upon the public in order to get them to accept or participate or tacitly accept war. And it goes systemically through all of the wars and shows that every single war is predicated upon lies, and that these lies and these narratives are the only way that the military-industrial complex is even able to get away with them. And it does seem that, to me, that post-Iraq, even to some extent post-Syria, that people do seem to be wising up to the cycle of the wars and the cycle of the narratives. And I just quickly wanted to talk to you about the role of the intelligence agencies in the creation and propagation of those narratives, and their intersection with mainstream media. So from studying the Snowden files, we found an incredibly important file where the NSA is internally congratulating itself for having provided, not just provided, but helping to draft the intel into the UN speeches of George W. Bush and of Colin Powell. And they were considering it to be a historic accomplishment of the agency and lauding themselves for it. Given that those speeches almost directly led to, millions and millions of deaths, is it really just the mainstream media that are so corrupt, or are there these shadowy figures behind it that are really driving it? What's the connection between the military and the media is really what I'm asking.
Yeah, I think you hit upon an essential point here. People in communication studies tend to get really focused on the media and the media itself. And of course, we were just criticizing the mainstream media, and I think that's a very legitimate thing to do. But this is a point which I increasingly make, and in a sense reflects my area of interest now with propaganda, is that we have to understand the manipulation of information. It's more than just the mainstream media. It's more than the mainstream media just getting it wrong. That when you start to look closely at propaganda and campaigns, etc., you start to see a very deep-rooted and a very extensive network of actors involved in the manipulation of information. And it's certainly the intelligence agencies and governments are involved in that. In the last 10 years, we've seen there's a lot of evidence with conflicts such as Syria. You see this incredible sort of nexus between NGOs, non-governmental organizations, media, films, etc., and security state, all engaged in sort of mobilizing bias, mobilizing opinion and behavior and actions. And of course, when it comes to conflict, of course, the intelligence agencies are very involved in that. And there are many ways you can come at this in terms of linking it back to the media. We know from the Cold War that there were plenty of people who were in mainstream media who were co-opted by the intelligence services. And it would be naive to think that isn't happening today. There's a whole number of other ways in which sort of information can be sort of manipulated and put through. And in some ways, the media does become this kind of just conduit for these kind of more powerful actors in the background, who are engaging in, often very sophisticated and also very long-term thinking about sort of, where do we want to get the population to? How do we want the population to think, etc.? What needs to be achieved, and so on. And it's interesting when you occasionally go to some of these military events or conferences where there are military people, or former ambassadors, for example, you do have them talking quite openly about management, the need to manage public perceptions, the need to carry the population from A to B. And of course, in the realm of international politics, it's often in relation to conflict and war and pursuit of what they perceive to be national interest. And I think really for all of us, starting to understand how extensive these kind of networks are, and also the important connection that they have with, for example, in the intelligence services, is an essential part of us arming and defending ourselves and starting to learn how to figure out really what's going on. Iraq's obvious, yeah. The wheels came off that one. We know the way in which the intelligence services were involved with the governments manipulating information and so on. Of course, Iraq isn't an exception. This is something which is going on continuously, and this is where WikiLeaks has been very important in revealing information. But we definitely need to get our sort of, as it were, our critical gaze onto this issue of these power networks. There are a number of terms people use. Some people call it the deep state. Other people call it the security complex, other national security complex. Others call it the military-industrial complex. I believe it was Eisenhower who coined that phrase, American president. But this is the reality of democracies today. Democracy is very much, I think, a veneer on these organized interests which work through, for some people, a surprising variety of institutions in society, not just the mass media. Look at Hollywood movies during the Cold War, for example, full of propaganda and manipulated information, etc. That when you start to understand that there's so many actors involved potentially in the mobilization of bias or propaganda, you start to realize what a problem that we have at the end of the day. And for sure, the intelligence services are a key part in all of this.
And we see that reflected internally within their documents as well. In their documents, they talk about NGOs as being recruitment pools. They supply the NGOs with covert funding for various projects. They have the NGOs recruit in staff, and then the intelligence agencies are in turn recruiting from those NGOs, which is one of the remarkable findings that we made there. But really, we've seen that the intelligence agencies have had their claws in almost every facet of human society. So one of the big claims that they've always made is that they're not involved in economic spying, but we discovered in the Snowden files that, in fact, they have a global economic security day, and they invite in all of the economics experts from around the world, and particularly from corporations. We saw, so they have these established, deep entrenched, established relationships right across industry. We saw them working on credit scoring technologies, and just all of this AI related financial stuff. We saw them having their hands in high school education projects. In one of the documents, they were running a competition for high school children, asking them in 2004, 2005, asking them to write a vision strategy document for 2020, what the world would be like, and then taking in these thousands through a proxy NGO, not doing it as the NSA, but it was in fact the NSA doing it, and then taking these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids' high school essays and mining them for ideas that they could then use for their own 2020 strategic planning documents for the intelligence agencies. And these are the types of things that just blow my mind, that they could have, that you could have your kid in high school writing an essay that ends up, implemented in the NSA's strategic planning documentation without even knowing it. It's all happening behind the scenes. And so then you think in terms of media, it's not beyond the realms of reasoning. I would think that there is, at least in the editorial suite of every major state broadcaster, that there will be those employees of the agencies having a hand in what it is that people are allowed to see and allowed to read.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think it was the church hearings in America. I mean, it ran off, wasn't it, a couple of hundred American journalists who were in some shape or form co-opted with the CIA. And that was came out in the hearings in America in the 70s, and there's no reason to think that isn't the case today. And going back to this point about democracy and so on, this is incredibly worrying for anyone who's a Democrat who believes in democracy. What this points towards is corruption of our democratic system, corruption by vested interests, by secretive interests. This is not how democracy is supposed to work. And I think the problem we have is that you have the penetration of the intelligence services, but of course we have this whole issue, as from Snowden leaks, with bulk data collection. I mean, and of course this has become so normalized now that I wonder how many young people, for example, really are fully aware of all the digital information which they're sending through their smartphones, computers.
Look, they're simply not, because when we talk about mass surveillance, we think of it as only affecting us as adults or as citizens or whatever. But what we don't understand, I believe, is how technology is being targeted even at the earliest generation. So I'm thinking about, there's something called Google Classroom. Google Classroom is from kindergarteners to primary and elementary school children. And in Google Classroom, it gives the teacher the spy role. So the teacher can see everything you're writing on your computer, every email that you send, every website that you look at, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, all this information, it's not just for the benefit of the teacher to be able to better monitor 30 kids in the room. All of that information is being sucked up into the Google Cloud and then straight to the NSA. So the NSA now knows what your 5-year-old kid is writing on their computer in the classroom. It's just absolutely abhorrent and ridiculous. But not only is it what they're reading, what they're choosing to write about, etc., it is it's mapping who are the other kids in their classrooms, who do they sit next to, what is their school schedule. It has like all their calendar and everything in there. What days do they have soccer practice, who goes to their soccer practice with them, you know, their entire lives of children, of minors, are completely digitally mapped out and sucked up into the spy clouds. And to me, this is just beyond Orwell. Beyond Orwell.
Yeah, it's extremely concerning, and this idea that the internet has this revolutionary potential, you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that sort of alternative media can really affect change, it's a game changer and so on, is always a double-edged sword, because this technology, as much as it sort of enables people to do what we're doing today, for example, it also is an incredible tool for powerful actors to exploit and to use. And again, this comes back to the point that in all of this, in all of these crises that we're all facing, and where people are trying to, you know, sort of save Julian Assange, etc., that there is this need to, I think, now move things towards, you know, consolidating political movement. And I'd say, you know, for me, it's not a left-right thing. For me, it's about getting democracy.
Oh, it's definitely not. It's definitely not.
Have a meaningful debate between left and right, we need to have a proper democratic functioning system. And that means you can't have pulse surveillance. You cannot have that violation of the private space. You know, the simple fact that people, you know, sort of people who are engaged in politics know that they're being monitored, this starts to affect their behavior and so on in a fundamentally undemocratic way. You know, this is a crisis, and you're absolutely right. This is Orwellian. It's worse than Orwell in many ways. He couldn't have imagined sort of how the kind of capability that there is. And these are the things, this is part of the crisis we have, I think. And we have corruption of our institutions, you know, increasingly corruption of NGOs, corruption of, I'd say, you know, the same problems that apply to the mass media apply to academia as well. And I say that as an academic. The kind of pressures and forces acting on academics are very similar to those acting on journalists. This is corruption, and this is why I think we need to, ultimately, as we go through all of these battles, we need to be thinking about how do we move forward to restore democracy, or restore Western countries to the kind of democratic systems which they claim to value and which they claim to operate according to those rules. And we need to find a way of getting that back, because we are in a desperate state. And, you know, there are some very worrying indications for the immediate future: conflict, war, Russia, China, and so on. These are all things which should be very much at the forefront of people's mind. But we have to I think, start moving and thinking about how we got ourselves into a very
hell of a mess. A hell of a mess.
And we need to start,
we need to start taking action, I agree. So somebody in chat just said, parents would be outraged if it was widely known what Suzie just said about Google Classroom and the targeting of very young children. And the thing is that the parents do know in the sense that the schools write a letter to the parents and they say, our school has just invested in this amazing new technology, which is going to create learning opportunities for your child. And your child is going to become more digitally adept and have fantastic computer skills, and it's going to empower their learning and empower their career. Now, what did I just say? What I just said was propaganda. The parents are being propagandized into the use of the technology without being fully informed of the flip side, which is actually some random person who decides to target your kid when he's 35 years of age is going to know that he did a school assignment on Afghanistan when he was 7 and be able to sit there and read it and psychoanalyze him based off his accrued writings and learnings of his entire scholastic career and whoever he associated with at that time and whatever extracurricular activities he was involved in. So this is a really great thought. This is a bit of an epiphany for me, Piers, which is, what is the role in propagandizing the public into consenting to the use of these technology, consenting to the cage being built around us, really?
Yeah, I mean, propaganda is operating on many levels, and part of it is getting people to accept what's being done. I mean, your propaganda persuading people to sort of support a war, for example, and you have propaganda which is involved in getting people to buy in to the products, buy into the systems which are being built around them, and so on. You know, if you look at, it's funny because when people sort of complain about Russian propaganda and Chinese propaganda, etc., and you look at the West is the birthplace of propaganda. You know, we used to call public relations propaganda until, as Eddie Bernays said, propaganda got a bad word because of the way the Germans used it, and so we came up with public relations. But if you look at the money and the resources put into public relations, PR propaganda in the West, it's vast, it's huge. And you see this, you know, it's almost operates at every level. In the institutions, you look at universities, for example, you look at any major institutions so geared up in terms of promotion, etc., in a way which, you know, is in some ways fundamentally sort of distorting, etc. And that's what you have in the West. You have promotion and manipulation going on across multiple levels, and you have an industry ultimately, as it were, a propaganda industry, which is, you know, one of the biggest industries in the West and one of the biggest industries in the world. And, you know, when you have that amount of money and resources being poured into manipulation of people's minds, you know, it becomes ubiquitous, I think.
I've been in the back of my mind throughout this interview, I've been thinking about what you've been saying about the need to activate, to form mass movements, to take action, because this is what I do. I work on building mass movements and have throughout the last 7 years. And we overcome the hurdle of educating the public. We overcome the hurdle of eventually forcing the media to cover our topics. We overcome the hurdle of bringing masses of people together to make that happen. We overcome the hurdle of getting to a position where we can directly confront government, and then we just get shut down. And so even once we can pierce the veil of the media lies, I'm thinking TPPA No Way movement, which is a mass movement against the TPP, which you may have heard of, is a very, very significant movement. And we got very close. We got very close on that fight in New Zealand, but we didn't make it. GCSB movement, we directly confronted mass surveillance in the intelligence agencies in 2013. We got so close it was down to one vote in Parliament to defeat their legislation for mass surveillance. We didn't make it. At the crux point, at the point close to where France is at right now, or maybe where France was a few months ago, where you get that mass congregation of active and engaged and knowledgeable people, the political structure just puts its middle finger up. And at that point, what can you do? And the other thing the other little epiphany I've had is that maybe the revolution that we need is to no longer consent. Rather than going for the mass movement and the head-on against the state collision, which we seem to lose, unfortunately, based on my experiences anyway. Not to say it can't be done and hasn't. There are historical examples of victories, but from my experience, we get to that point and we can't get any further. Maybe what we need to do is to not consent, to not pay the British broadcasting license fee once a year, to not sign the permission letter from the school that comes home telling us that we should sign our kids up for Google Classroom, to not accept the user agreement on the app, which has a list of permissions this long that it wants from our device. Is that what we need to do? That kind of, to reject the system?
I mean, direct action, etc., has been, you know, always a part of the protests throughout history and so on, and it's one way to go. I'd actually say the bigger issue here, because you talked about sort of various points at which, you know, we achieve so much in one particular issue area, but then it's closed down and so on. I think, as I was saying before, what we need to do, we need to sort of, as it were, diagnose what the central problem here is at the moment. And I think the central problem is it's a combination of a loss of democracy and a level of propaganda, which means that this level of control over us by powerful actors is just overwhelming. So we start to recognize that those are the two problems, that the energy then needs to be focused in on dealing with that. Once you can start to restore democracy, get institutions back, then you can, I think, start to have rational debates, and you can start to have less self-interested debates over issues and so on. But before we can do any of that, we've got to restore the democratic institutions. So in my mind, I think we need to be looking at a political movement which needs to be based around sort of principles of recognizing the level of manipulation and propaganda there is, but then transforming that into a real drive to restore democracy, restore the institutions, and then we can
so
go.
what are the democratic institutions? I mean, some people would say it's the judiciary, some people would say it's policy and parliament, some people would say it's the media, the public media. What are the democratic institutions that you believe need to be restored in order to have progress?
For example, when we were talking about the media and we were talking about democracy, the idea of the media and democracy is supposed to create a public sphere where there can be debate. The media is supposed to be independent of political power, independent of economic power, and to reflect a plurality of viewpoints. It doesn't do that at the moment. You change that, you get that back to functioning how it should be functioning in democracy, where the media is genuinely independent of government, genuinely independent of powerful economic actors. And then you've solved that problem. And this is the case across all the sort of institutions, etc., in civil society and in government. We were talking about NGOs earlier. It's about getting the system back to the state where it's operating according to what we expect. It's fairly straightforward things, but what you expect in terms of proper separation of powers, what you expect in terms of the role of the media and so on. And those are the things which I think really need to get tackled at this point in time. Because unless we tackle that, even if we win victories, then you're still going to be in a dysfunctional political system which won't be able to affect the change that you want.
So I'd say two things back to that. One is I remember interviewing Chris Lynn Hedges, amazing Pulitzer Prize winner and war correspondent of many years. He said in the 60s and 70s, public television platformed Noam Chomsky. They platformed Malcolm X. He said there was space in the media and on the media platforms for dissident voices, and that has completely been eradicated. And that is a huge part of the problem. Those media platforms must be open media platforms for all voices across the spectrum. They should not be allowed to push out certain voices at all. I've just lost the second thing I wanted to say to you, which is really important. But I also, before I let you go, I did want to ask you specifically about Integrity Initiative, because I know that you've done a lot of work around that. And I know that it outed a number of journalists as being affiliated with nefarious forces. But who are those other nefarious forces? Is this tracking back to military and intelligence agencies, or is it to government, diplomatic, political? Where's it going? I just remembered the point I want to ask you, which is about information warfare and counterinsurgency doctrine. We'll get to that after you tell us about Integrity Initiative.
Well, the Integrity Initiative is, although it's an NGO, it's a charity set up, it's heavily staffed by military, ex-military, it's funded by the UK government, trying to create clusters, networks of journalists and academics and so on, but it's clearly being driven by actors. Anybody objectively looking at it would say, well, these are clearly quite very closely located or part of, if you want to call it, a military-industrial complex in the UK. It's a government-led driven propaganda operation. It's extremely worrying one, extremely, in a sense, well, it's only open because the documents have been leaked, but surprisingly brazen to the extent to which it involves trying to co-opt journalists and academics who, any of them who are co-opted and have signed the confidentiality agreements, you would have expected them to know better than to do that. But it's a very interesting topic. I recommend viewers to dig into that, but the Integrity Initiative is a very real demonstration of the kind of propaganda problem that we've been talking about.
So it's the real world model of what you've been discussing, like in terms of with names.
Well, it's the latest example. So the latest formulation, because the documents have been leaked, as you know, you can start to see what's going on. I don't think it's anything very different, in particular from what's gone on before, but it's certainly sort of the latest. If anyone wants to say, oh, well, propaganda is something we used to do a few years back and so on, not anymore, which I think sort of a lot of politicians and people in the military are keen to suggest, it shows you that it's alive and kicking now.
Okay, so the last topic that I wanted to talk to you about was information warfare in the military context. So I'll just intro it, going back to what you said before. I asked you, what are the democratic institutions that we need to change? What do we need to go after? And you said that primarily the media is the fundamental one. And I thought to myself, but surely the intelligence agencies are a bigger problem, or the military is a bigger problem, or the politicians are a bigger problem. Really, aren't the media just the bottom rungs? And then I remembered a military strategy document which had a graphic figure on it, and it was their graphic representation of how they maintain societal control. And they had 3 pillars. One was the security pillar, which is the security agencies, the police agencies, the intelligence agencies, etc. One was an economic pillar, which was the banks and the economic infrastructure of a country or any territory. The third pillar was the political pillar, which is, you know, your councilman, your state representative, your head of state, your prime minister, whatever, the political infrastructure. Those 3 pillars were resting on a base, on a foundation. And if you poison the foundation, you can bring down all 3 pillars at once. Because if you just bring down one pillar, the other 2 stand and they hold the structure together. So if you just go after the security agencies, you still have the economic power and the political power. If you just go after the economic, you still have the political and the security power, et cetera, et cetera. The only way that you could destabilize all 3 of those pillars was by going after the foundation, and the foundation said information. Information. And they said that if you poison or manipulate the well of information that the society consumes, circulates, and functions on, that you can bring down all 3 pillars. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing them try to do and fail miserably to do with Venezuela right now. It's what we saw them try to do with Assad and be somewhat successful for a number of years, but also ultimately fail on. It's what we saw them be initially very successful in Iraq, but ultimately fail on. So what is your take on that? Do you believe, like I said, I think that does validate your position that whoever is trading in information, which is obviously the media, procuring and circulating information, which is the media, is the portal to that foundation of information that ultimately maintains or fails to maintain the system of control over a territory?
Well, okay. I mean, when I said the media, as just giving an example, I mean, we need to deal with all of the institutions across democracies to resolve the kind of problems that we have at the moment. Look, for sure, it is a question of information, and it's a question of combating propaganda. But I'd like to think that it's not just a matter of, you know, getting the truth out to people. Yeah, it's also a matter of people acting and mobilizing, which is this kind of theme I've had throughout of the importance of grassroots. That we change things, by getting the truth, by sort of undermining the disinformation which underpins what we see. But it also requires people to act as well. It's not just, in a sense, it's not just an informational thing. So, you know, as much as we're involved in coordinating, integrating over the internet and so on, we need to just translate that into, I think, ultimately, how do we work at the grassroots level? Do I engage with the people immediately around me in my community? And so the mobilization I'm trying to achieve through the internet, you also need to be getting people face to face. I think that's how that's how I think a movement to restore democracy in the West, that's where it will come from, is by people actually talking to their neighbors as well as talking to each other over the internet. So, you know, you've got to do both at the end of the day. You've got to combat the information and the disinformation and propaganda and so on. But you also need to remember that people need to mobilize. Every significant movement throughout history has involved people getting out, acting. France,
we had someone Yeah, absolutely, France. Case in point. Absolutely. We had someone in Vienna, Austria yesterday say, this is so inspiring seeing the protests in London and the protests in Paris, because there was a big protest for WikiLeaks in Paris yesterday. What can I do? I'm just one person. I don't know anyone who cares about this. And we said, take a stick of chalk and go to the middle of the central business district and find the street which has the most foot traffic and just write hashtag protect Julian. And a percentage of people walking past will type that into their phones. They'll think, oh, what's that? And type it in or web search it or whatever. And they will then have access to information that they otherwise may never have found or stumbled across. Something as simple, an action as simple as that can actually be incredibly powerful in terms of the number of eyes that you can get on a message.
Yeah, we shouldn't be too seduced by the internet and so it's critical, but we should be going out and doing that at the same time. Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Piers. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? And just in terms of the information being the pillar, I think the severity of the state response to Julian and to WikiLeaks has been precisely because they have threatened that pillar, and they've threatened that pillar on a global scale. They have changed the pool of information, and that's how they have got to be enemy number one.
Absolutely. That's why they've become so coercive in this situation. Yes.
Is there anything else you would like to say before we head off?
Well, good luck to you, and I wish that Assange and there can be a resolution and he can be freed in the way that he obviously should be. I hope that he keeps doing what he's doing. All the people around him, WikiLeaks, keep on doing what they're doing. I hope we see some justice there. And I hope that people take what's happening with him and the experience and what we learn from that to do what we've been saying, which is that we all need to we're at a point in our democracies where people really need to stand up and start to demand restoration of democracy, demand truth, and end the kind of corruption and propaganda that we've been seeing. So, but I'll leave it with, keep going, Julian Assange.